What's up, Zach here, and today I've got the all-new 361 Degrees BIG3 5.0 Pro PE Joker. That is a mouthful.
These things are just some of the most interesting shoes out there. Like I said, we've been seeing some new releases in the maximalist department, and honestly, these are one of the best that I've tested. So let's get into them. And a huge thanks, 361 Degrees, for sending me a pair of these. Check out. However, this video is by no means sponsored, and as always, all opinions, good, bad, and different, are all my own. Now, starting off in the uppers of the Joker PE, honestly, it's kind of hard to figure out where to start in them because, as you can see, there is quite a bit going on. Now, in terms of the forefoot area, I guess I'll just start in the distal part of the shoe. You can see there's a really chunky TPU weave. It's thin, but it's, like I said, it's very substantial. Now, that weaving underneath of it gives way to this textile and TPU honeycombing, which is actually really strong for how light it is. I was shocked at how light these shoes were. I mean, they feel light on hand, but sometimes, you know, if you're expecting a really heavy shoe and then it's not as heavy as you expect, you know, in hand, it can kind of lie to you. But on the scale, that scale does not lie. Really interesting at how, you know, kind of the breadth of the uppers is just very, very light TPU weaving, which is nice to see. Now, with that, the tongue is also ultra thin, right? It doesn't really start to get padded up until the more proximal ankle, right, as it kind of goes more vertical into the high top. And what's interesting about that is you would think the laces would irritate you a ton, but because they have this backing on the underneath side of them, it almost kind of raises them above that level, and so it's a little bit more even with your foot, so you really don't get any lace irritation whatsoever, which I was shocked with. I thought these were really going to get annoying. The one thing that was a little bit annoying about the lace line is it is a little bit hard to get them kind of tied tight the way you want them to. So when you get them out of the box, I would just loosen up all the laces to start with and then start playing with them, because if you try just to go in there and pull, the way this quick lock is in here, you know, where the laces kind of go onto the tongue, which is nice because it locks the tongue down, and just with the backing underneath of them, like I said, the laces don't want to move, which is nice. Once you lock it down, it's locked down. But getting them tied down in the first place, like I said, can be a little bit of an annoyance. So just make sure to save yourself from that. When you get them out of the box, just loosen them all up from the toe down and then start working your way up. Just give yourself a little more custom feel. Obviously, with all the padding in the ankle collar, it is very broad padding and it is very high ankle collar. And the last two lace eyelets are a little bit, you know, wide set from each other. So you're getting a fantastic lockdown. I mean, there's no heel slippage in these whatsoever, and you would expect that from a shoe with this kind of collar. And speaking of expectations, you look at this thing on the breathability test, it did heat up 121.5 degrees, which I kind of expected that. You know, if you look at the breathability mapping of these things too, as you can see, I mean, fog is getting out of the tongue, the forefoot of the shoe, the distal forefoot, it's coming out of there like crazy. It's even starting to creep out the sides of it, but there's just so much material in more of a high top shoe that's going to hold on to a little bit more heat and moisture. So honestly, for a high top and with this much material and how substantial they are, I thought these were pretty middle of the road. They do much better with moisture, you know, with moisture egress, you can see with that fog machine versus heat, because like I said, if you're getting anything higher up in the ankle collar, it's going to start to hold on to a little more heat versus a much more low top shoe. But for the profile of the shoe, you know, still okay. You look at this thing though on the upper durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper. This is where I was really shocked. This drag guard here is incredibly thin. I thought the burr was going to just pummel right through it. It does not. Which was crazy to see. And on the underside of this weaving, as you can see, this little red streak here, it almost looks like a snake's tongue. That is another piece of this drag guard material. So even though on this portion, the burr does get through the outer side of the weave, it does not make an impression on that underside drag guard. So there actually is 2 layers of dragging on this. These are definitely meant for, you know, indoor hardwood rubberized courts, as we'll see when we get to the outsole section. So in terms of dragging and sliding on indoor courts, I mean, these things are going to be just fine. On outdoor courts, I mean, you're going to start tearing through them, especially in the outsole. But for what they're intended for, yeah, they're going to last you the duration. And getting into the midsole teardown, this is actually pretty interesting. Number one, you have a carbon fiber shank that does go from the rear foot into the midfoot, so that does cross a zone. On top of that, you've got a near full bed of thermoplastic foam. What's interesting though is you look at the carrier foam that goes around these, that actually goes into a ground contact foam, right? There is a rubber piece that goes around the heel, right? But you actually do have ground contact foam underneath of the thermoplastics, which actually creates the carrier, which I thought is nice. It creates a lot more structure to the shoe, which is nice. Then as you go into the forefoot, you actually have this little TPU piece, right? This little like halo piece that goes into the forefoot that almost, I mean, it's not necessarily a shank, but it definitely gives a little bit more structure to the very thin rubber, which we'll get to in the outsole section. What I thought was interesting about this setup was in the rear foot, 35 centimeters on the bounce height test, and then in the forefoot, 42. You can kind of see where that ground contact foam, a little bit more deadened, and then in the forefoot, that's where you get the more bounce, which I thought was interesting that, how much influence there was there. So obviously you're going to get a little bit more, crash landing protection in the rear foot, going to get a little bit more, pop in the forefoot. Suffice to say, it is still a full bed of thermoplastics. So especially for a higher top shoe, these definitely feel a little bit more punchy. They definitely feel a little bit more springy. And you would hope, for someone, like Nikola Jokic, who is a big dude and needs a lot of structure under his foot, so he's not pummeling through the shoe. And getting in the outsole tread, this is something, we're getting used to seeing with a lot of other 361-degree shoes. It's just a lot of these put together pie-shaped tread pods, which, like I said, do really well for multi-directional traction. It really does not matter which way you are planting on the court, these things are going to grab traction. But because it is such a flat tread profile, right? I mean, the tread depth is so low, they still roll to the next step very easily. This much more reminds me, especially on the medial side, a little more rolled rubber. And then, speaking of rubber, in the rear foot, you can see this little horseshoe pattern. That is a rubber insert. And then on the central portion of the rear foot going into the midfoot, like I said, that's a ground contact foam. That's a ground facing foam. You look at it on the grip test ramp, still doesn't slip till 41 degrees. So it's still getting up there, right? I mean, it still has good tack. And you look at it on the grip, on the viewing box, you can kind of see it's more of a flat tread pattern. So there's not a ton of movement. You can kind of see it all kind of moves as almost like a suction cup, right? It kind of all contacts the ground at the same time and kind of all works as one unit, which is nice. I do like that there is kind of competing materials down here. You got rubber and then foam and rubber again. So, you can kind of count on that rubber interaction with the ground, but you are getting a little bit more forgiveness in that ground contact foam on the bottom. So that if you're wearing a shoe, kind of this substantial and this maximalist, it's still going to roll to the next step easier, which I think is kind of nice, especially because, like I said, these aren't meant for outdoor courts. They are meant for indoor courts. On an outdoor court, this is going to get torn up. So, like I said, as long as you keep it on the surface it wants to be on, I think it's going to do okay. Speaking of that, you look at this thing on the outsole durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper. On the rubber portions, not even a millimeter of damage. I mean, the durometer is above 16. So, I mean, it's still a decently hard rubber. On the foam portion, like I said, the burr just starts to pummel right through it. But if you look at this thing on the speedy ratio, I thought that was the more interesting part. It comes in at a 2.49 shank score of 0.2, brings it up to a 2.69. For a shoe this maximalist, for that to, be up there, I think that's fantastic. And honestly, that's how they felt. I noticed even short court movements or, kind of going up and down the court, right, for some of the runouts we were doing in my lessons. Honestly, they felt great. I mean, they were given some pop. Like I said, they felt very punchy underfoot. They felt like a lot more of the more minimalist 361-degree shoes out there, which I've talked about, earlier in the year, which, like I said, they just feel like a breeze getting up and down the court. These were no different, especially once you break in the ankle collar, right, and the heel counter. And so when you first put them on, they feel pretty substantial around there. They're giving you a pretty decent lockdown too, but they're going to feel substantial. Once you break that in, honestly, sometimes you forget you're wearing a shoe this substantial, right, this maximalist, and honestly, that's the rub with more maximalist shoes. It's getting them to move, right? It's getting them to feel like you're moving in them, especially with how wide the flange is here, and it's all outsole rubber based. So, I mean, you're getting stability, but you're not, like I said, the shoe isn't super clunky because the flange is made of all rubber. It's not the entire shoe pushing out here, which I think that's fine if a company wants to do that. More stability, the better in my book. But if you can get away with a design like this, like I said, the shoe is going to feel like a lot more of a minimalist shoe, and it's going to feel a lot more punchy and a lot more speedy. And like I said, with a more flat tread profile on these, a little bit easier to roll from step to step with the rubber design, you're going to get a shoe that feels really fast, but also gives you, a lot of protection. Now, getting into the fit of the Joker PEs, this is, I think, where the lace line also kind of came into play. Now, number one, they have a 14-degree in flare by my count, which is, it's getting up there. And like I said, with a lot of times you get a shoe this maximalist, you kind of need it for a little bit, easier feeling transition step. The other thing is, you look at the width of them, they come in at 9.7 centimeters, a length of 29 centimeters, so just a hair long, a toe box width of 10.5 centimeters, and a toe box taper of 28 degrees. So, you know, you would think these are very forgiving shoes, and they are, especially for, like I said, a more maximalist shoe. One thing I noticed is I was still having cramping in my left foot when I played in them the first time, and that was because of the laces. Once I messed with the laces, then that cramping went completely away. Also, sometimes, like I said, because the inflare of some shoes, if it doesn't match up with your foot and you have a really wide lateral foot like I do, sometimes that can mess with it. But like I said, once I got the laces right, that's when it kind of all went away. I'd say if you are a narrow foot, you might want to consider going down a half size on these because you get the weight reduction. Like I said, they're going to feel even speedier for you. I think a medium and a 2E foot go true to size of 4E. I think if you go up more than 1/2 size, it's going to start to get to be a lot of shoe. In terms of the snake bitten foot, honestly, it's dealer's choice on these. Number one, you can fit an orthotic or a brace in these pretty easily, right? As long as you mess with the laces before you put them on. But on their own, especially in the rear foot, where you get kind of the double stacked foam there, right? A little bit more shock absorbing foam on the bottom, and you got the thermoplastic on top of it, which 361 degrees thermoplastics are also, they're very good with shock absorption, but having that layer there, that's really nice. And then having the shank go a little bit further back. So really, any snake bite on your foot, lumps, bumps, bruises, you know, from heel pain, ball of foot pain, tendonitis, you know, lateral ankle sprainer, midfoot sprainer, these things are going to be very nice for. And you would expect that from a shoe this maximalist with this much going on in the midsole. But suffice to say, if you're looking for a shoe for protection or to fit a bulkier orthotic or brace in, yeah, this is your shoe. But getting into the performance of the Joker PE, I talked about this in one of my tennis reviews. I really hadn't done much in about 3.5 weeks. Went to the Olympics for 12 days and then came home and immediately got incredibly sick for the better part of almost 2 weeks. And so the first time coming back on a basketball court, this is what I had on. And honestly, I was just so happy to have a shoe on like this that was that forgiving as well as this protective. Remember, a high top is not going to stop an ankle sprain, but just with, like I said, the profile, the flange, and how these things sit, I mean, these are just incredibly protective and incredibly stable shoes. And so kind of coming back and just lumbering my way through kind of my first lesson back. The one thing I noticed is when we were doing lessons with these, we were going from stations that were kind of in an L shape, right? So we were on kind of one court, then coming into another, then going all the way down the court after that, right? So making these huge L's. And we were going from front to back, side to side, then actually sidestepping to almost backstepping, dribbling with my left hand, which was, that's a disaster to begin with when I haven't been playing in a while. But I noticed, man, these were nimble enough to get me going, right? I did not feel any extra, elephant footedness, which a lot of times is the case with me because, like I said, I can get really clunky with my footwork. It more felt like I was in a more, minimalist 361 degree shoes, which, like I said, we've talked about. Some of those models have just been fantastic for feeling very nimble on court while also very sure-footed. This was kind of the same thing. This was kind of like just, the big sibling to those shoes. In the fact, like, if I'm starting here, kind of double time, dribble between the legs, and then kind of going backwards almost like, on a 45-degree angle, trying to dribble left and then step back and shoot. Like I said, I felt great in these. I mean, I felt really these felt really easy to do that in, as easy as I get away with that. In terms of repeat layups or rebounds, things like that, they felt great too. Like I said, they have enough launch in them for that. Honestly, kind of taking the pedigree from other 361 degree shoes and then bringing them up to more of a big shoe, it was a really nice surprise of how good these felt. And from Jokic coming from the Nike GT Jump, I know he was supposed to be in the GT Jump too, but he kept going back to the GT Jump. Going from that to this, it just feels like this is more of a lighter version of that shoe with easier traction. Like, that's what this feels like. So in terms of a signature shoe, this really, to me, rings true to that, right? That this actually was meant for somebody like him, right? This was actually meant for his type of playing style, especially with him where he gets into these really bizarre situations and he's just chucking shots over his head sometimes. It just gets into these weird situations. I think in these, especially when you're on one foot trying to lift off or whatever, or if you're coming down into a crowd, this is just such a stable, easy shoe to pop up off the ground with. And so I'd really love to hear your thoughts on these, especially if you watched the review of the BIG3 5.0 Quick Pro and kind of seen the similarities between the shoes, as more of like the maximalist uppers. Love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Speaking of that shoe, if you do want to see the deep dive and teardown of the BIG3 5.0 Quick Pro, one of those shoes, like I said, one of my favorites for multi-sports, right? All the way from basketball, tennis to pickleball. Make sure you click into this video up above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam. I'll see you somewhere in the Sneakerverse.